I grew up treasuring nature so much. If I went to the woods, fishing, or in the mountains, the tranquility these experiences brought with them had no match. Some were even ethereal. I could feel Mother Nature living and breathing, always ensuring I had everything I needed while stepping on its rich grounds. Last year, I bought a cabin up in the mountains. I have always liked to disconnect from the city in the cold winter and just go to a place that feels like magic. This cabin had the feeling of being somewhere in that realm. Excitement took over me when I thought I finally had my own place in the snowy mountains, away from the city, away from work, and from people who make so much noise that sometimes I just need a little breather. So the acquisition of the log cabin couldn't have come at a better time. With my head almost exploding and my mind fogged with the dullest things and the most mundane tasks possible at work, I couldn't wait for a few days to recharge my batteries. With no other than my trusted associate, my daring sidekick, and my best friend, the Irish setter Blaze, who had just turned 6 years old, I decided to pack all the things needed and go. I drove for almost 3 hours. The trees hung heavy with snow, and the flakes fell slowly on the ground. I felt like being in a fairy tale, a vastness of white that conquered all the old land for miles and miles in front of my eyes. I stopped the car somewhere along the way to get fresh water from a spring that ran through the frozen woods. The sight was a spectacle, and I couldn't help but drink. It was so cold I felt my chest turning to ice. Yet it was so refreshing. So I took a few gallons with me for the cabin so Blaze and I wouldn't get dehydrated. I reached the cabin in the afternoon. The temperature began dropping as nightfall approached. I had maybe 2 hours tops of daylight. I parked the car, took the supplies and food inside, turned on the generator, grabbed some firewood, and threw it into the fireplace. I poured some gasoline over and the flame engulfed the logs. After that, I began shoveling the snow on the front porch and around the house. I also took my hunting rifle because I thought a rabbit stew wouldn't hurt anyone. I always liked it, and Blaze liked it too. Time passed quickly enough, and after finishing all the chores, the time came to go inside and make some food. I had some canned dog food for Blaze, and as I felt my stomach growling, the mouth-watering image of sausage and eggs on toast came to mind. I lit some candles to make the ambiance more pleasant. I also turned on a lantern, and everything seemed to be perfect. Night fell over the isolated cabin, and the winter winds howled outside over the infinite blanket of snow. Shadows danced on the walls like little devils. The crackling wood sang its song, bringing peace to my tired mind. The cabin felt like a gift from God. I had no television to distract me and didn't check the internet. I only kept my cell phone with me as a precautionary measure because accidents could have happened. Even though the reception had been pretty bad, it still allowed to call 911. After finishing eating, I enjoyed a beer and a book. I fell asleep in an instant, poof, just like that. The fresh air has had this effect on me ever since I was a kid. The book fell from my lap and thudded on the floor. I instantly jolted awake and saw Blaze looking at the door. He stood still, mildly growling. "What's wrong, boy?" I asked. I could see he was trembling both with anger and fear. He began nervously barking. I had never seen him like that before. Outside, in the howling wintry winds, I heard some sort of static sound combined with a low gurgling sound. It was as if someone was zapping through a broken TV where one channel was just annoying static, and the next was unspeakable monsters raging. I peeked outside and saw nothing. Then I grabbed my rifle and wanted to open the door and check it out in person. Yet Blaze wouldn't let me do that. Instead, he stood before the door, barking at me this time. Whatever roamed outside, Blaze felt it necessary to let me know if I went there, I would have found only death. "What the hell is that thing out there, goddammit?" I whispered to myself. I glanced outside the window again, and I thought I saw a shadowy figure looking at the cabin. It looked back and then went out of sight. Blaze barked as loud as his lungs could take it. "Blaze, come here, boy, get here now," I called him. The only weak point was the window. If whatever was outside wanted to jump through like a beast, I said let it have it. I would have put 2 bullets between its eyes in seconds. Blaze would have probably eaten the whole thing in one big fat meal. The static and gurgling sounds never ceased, even though the creature had vanished. I rechecked the window. Nothing. I only heard those damn sounds. After a while, a large band came from the door, and then it came again, repeatedly. It shook, and I got my gun ready to shoot. If that door had fallen, the death of whatever was on the side would have been swift. "Hey man, open up. These things outside will kill me. Please," the voice of a scared man said. He kept banging on the door as if his life depended on it. And it did. If I didn't act fast, the poor man would have been mauled to death by whatever beasts roamed the old mountain. "Hold up! I'm coming!" I cried. I had to help that Moorman. He was probably lost, scared, alone, and dehydrated. Blaze jumped in front of the door. He barked at me again, pushing me back. Something was wrong if he did that. "Come on, man, just open the goddamn door already, will ya?" He banged again. Blaze kept on barking violently. "Sorry, hoss. No can do," I replied, understanding that this was something else, not a man. I trusted Blaze more than I trusted myself. He was one brave and intelligent dog, a true friend and companion. The beast howled, and I heard its voice changing as it drowned. It coughed, it spat, and I thought it was asphyxiating. "Sweetie, can you please open up for Mama? I have a gift for you. It took me so long to find you, and I want to give it to you," my mother's voice said. "What the?" I said, almost dropping the rifle from my hands. My mom died when I was just a kid, and except for her warm smile, the voice was the only other thing I remembered about her. Then banging noises came from around the house, as if the number of creatures outside had grown exponentially. I had gone there expecting to find paradise and solitude, but it turns out hell had frozen over in that exact place. Nothing natural and of this world could have made those noises, and then mimicked my dead mother's voice. Again, I checked the situation outside. The shadowy creatures had grown in numbers. I counted 12 of them. 6 just stood motionless, while the other 6 growled, snarled, and howled in the dead of night. I saw one of them coming closer to the window and went a few steps back. It glued its dead eyes to the window. It didn't have a nose, just 2 small holes. Its mouth was a straight horizontal line. It opened it and sucked on the window. In doing so, it revealed small rows of sharp teeth. "Why don't you open up for your dear old grandfather? It's cold outside, sonny boy," the creature snarled. "Grandpa died too when I was just a kid. After my mom's death, he had a heart attack because he couldn't cope with her being gone. I just looked at it as it mimicked my grandfather's voice. I don't know how the hell it knew my mom's or my grandfather's voice, but it happened. Maybe it read my mind and browsed my memories. Maybe by doing so, it extracted their voices from my head. Hell, this sounded crazy as hell to me, but what I had witnessed shouldn't have been possible. And just seeing that craziness, every scenario I thought of might have been likely. The glass began to crack under the pressure of the creature's face, but fortunately, I had parked the Jeep right in front of the house so that I might have just made a run for it. The banging all across the house intensified, and I felt the pressure of death clawing my heart. The window would give in soon, so I said to hell with it. Instead, I pointed the rifle straight at the ugliness and pulled the trigger. It blasted its head into millions of pieces and everything stopped. "Blaze, we're going to make a run for it, buddy," I said, hoping for the both of us to escape that mess. I grabbed a burning piece of wood from the fireplace with one and busted through the door. The shadowy creatures had even grown in numbers, probably 20 or 30 of them. Blaze barked, foaming at the mouth. "William, William, William," a raspy voice said. It was alien to me, not similar to anyone I knew. I turned around and saw them all gathered in a herd waiting to attack. "Stay back," I said, threatening them with the torching wood. They hissed and collectively stepped back. I threw the wood at them and they scattered in an instant. I opened the car door for Blaze to go in, and he immediately jumped in the passenger seat. A pair of claws grabbed my ankle from under the Jeep and pulled me. It caused me to fall, and I saw the abomination crawling up on my leg. I hit it in the head with the butt of the rifle. Then, when it hissed with its horrible mouth, I put the barrel in it and shot. It blew its brain out on the side of my car. I hit the ignition and the car came to life. Blaze was agitated and scared. I patted him on the head and told him it would be all right. I pushed the pedal to the metal and ran over those creatures, feeling their skulls crack under the wheels. A few hours later, I was back in my apartment with Blaze. It was quiet. Maybe the city wasn't so bad after all. This happened last year. A few weeks after the incident, I received an anonymous message saying, "Hello, William. You need to come back to the cabin. There are urgent matters that I need to talk to you about. I am one of your neighbors. Sincerely, Thomas." I did remember seeing a few houses on my way up there, but didn't think to stop. Also, the former owner had vanished into thin air. I didn't go back yet, maybe somewhere in the future. The old ranger station had been abandoned for years, but it was the only shelter for miles. My sister and I stumbled upon it after our snowmobile broke down halfway through our winter expedition. The sun was setting and the temperature was dropping fast. We had no choice but to take refuge inside. The station was small, with peeling paint and boarded-up windows. Inside, it was even colder than outside. The air felt heavy, as if the place itself were holding its breath. We lit a fire in the rusted stove and settled in for the night, but the unease lingered. I woke to the sound of faint voices. At first, I thought it was my sister talking in her sleep, but when I turned, I saw her wide awake, staring at the door. "Do you hear that?" she whispered. I nodded, my heart pounding. The voices were faint, almost indistinguishable from the wind, but they were there, multiple voices, overlapping, murmuring. We tried to ignore it, telling ourselves it was just the wind. But the next day, things got worse. The voices grew louder, clearer. By nightfall, we could make out fragments of sentences. "Help me. So cold. Why did you leave?" The words echoed through the station, coming from everywhere and nowhere. We searched the place, looking for some logical explanation. Maybe an old radio picking up signals? But we found nothing. That night, the whispers turned into screams. They sounded like people freezing to death, their cries of agony reverberating through the walls. We huddled together by the fire, too terrified to move. Around midnight, the screaming stopped. The silence that followed was even worse. Then came the knocking. Slow, deliberate, on the door. I grabbed the fire poker and my sister held the flashlight as we approached. "Who's there?" I called, my voice trembling. No answer, just more knocking. I opened the door, but no one was there. Just the empty, snow-covered forest. The knocking continued, moving to the windows, the walls, even the roof. It was as if something was toying with us, waiting for us to break. When dawn finally came, we packed our gear and left, ignoring the lingering whispers that followed us into the woods. I later learned that the station had been the site of a tragedy years ago. A group of campers had gotten lost in a storm and taken refuge there. None of them survived. Their bodies were found weeks later, frozen and huddled together. I don't know if their spirits are still trapped there, but I'll never forget their voices, begging for help in the frozen night. It's always the cold that gets to you first, the cold that cuts through your skin and freezes your soul. That's what I remember about the night they disappeared. It had been years since the incident, but the memories are as fresh as the snow on the ground. I still see them, my friends, out there in the snow, their eyes wide with fear, their mouths open as if they were trying to scream. But no sound came. It was December when we went out into the woods. We were young, wild, and too reckless to know better. We had heard the stories of people who vanished, lost to the wilderness and never seen again, but we never took them seriously. After all, it was just a group of us hiking, just a weekend trip in the mountains. The storm hit as we were about halfway through the hike. A blizzard, thick and fast, dropping the temperature so quickly that our breath became visible within seconds. We tried to make our way back, but the wind was relentless, biting at our faces, the snow blurring everything. The world was a haze of white, and our tracks were quickly swallowed up. That's when we lost them. I don't know how it happened, whether they strayed off the path, whether they turned a corner I didn't see. But one moment they were with me, and the next, nothing. I called out to them, my voice muffled by the storm, but there was no answer. I never found them that night. The authorities found no trace of them either. No footprints, no signs of struggle, no nothing. Just the endless snow. 10 years passed, and I had long given up hope. Life went on. The memory of that night faded into the background, a distant scar on my psyche. I moved away from the area, found a new life, but something always lingered in the back of my mind, a nagging, uncomfortable feeling. Then last winter, they came back. It was late at night when I heard the knock on the door. The wind was howling again, and the storm outside mirrored the one from that fateful night. I looked through the peephole, half expecting it to be a trick of the light, but there they were, 3 figures standing in the snow just as they had been all those years ago. I froze. My heart skipped a beat. They were alive. I couldn't believe it. But they weren't the same. Their eyes were empty, hollow, and their skin was pale, almost translucent. Their clothes were tattered as if they had been living in the cold for years. And their faces, those faces, once familiar, now twisted with something unholy, were not the faces I had known. I opened the door instinctively, but the air that hit me was frigid, like stepping into a freezer. They didn't speak. They didn't move. They just stared at me, their eyes unblinking. What happened to you? I asked, my voice barely a whisper. One of them opened its mouth, but no words came out. Instead, a cold, raspy wind blew from their lips, and I felt it. Something dark, something ancient, pressing in on me. It felt like they weren't just there. They had been waiting for me, for this moment. And then, just as quickly as they had appeared, they were gone, vanished into the night, leaving nothing but the wind and the snow behind. I never saw them again, but I know they're still out there, waiting. Just like the others, lost to the cold, to the darkness, and now I understand. They didn't just disappear. They were taken. And soon they'll come for me too. The storm had been howling for days, a relentless, icy wind that seemed to gnaw at everything it touched. The once beautiful winter landscape had transformed into a desolate, frozen wasteland. Snowdrifts as high as houses stacked along the side of the road, blocking the view of the world beyond. It felt like the entire town had been swallowed up by the storm, isolated in its frigid grip. I lived in a small cabin on the outskirts of town, a place I had moved to years ago for the quiet, the peace, and the solitude. I didn't mind being alone. It suited me, until the winter came, and everything about it turned hostile. The cold here was unlike anything I'd ever known, a biting, suffocating cold that seemed to sink into your bones and never leave. This year it felt even worse. I remember the day the news came. It was the beginning of January, and there had been whispers in town about people who had vanished, disappeared without a trace in the midst of the storm. 2 people, local families, gone. No signs of struggle, no footprints, no clues, just gone. The authorities chalked it up to the weather, but deep down, I knew something more sinister was at play. I hadn't thought much of it at first. This town had always had an eerie undertone, something about the stillness that made you question your senses. But as days passed and the cold deepened, the sense of unease grew. I started noticing things. A light flickering in the distance, too far for anyone to be out in that storm, but there it was, and the strange echoing noises at night, the ones that sounded like whispers but always stopped when I tried to pinpoint them. Then, one evening, they returned. I had just stepped outside to grab some firewood when I saw them, figures in the distance trudging through the snow. I squinted, barely able to make them out in the dark, their figures oddly distorted by the thick falling snow. But the way they moved, the way they walked, it was unnatural. I ran back inside, heart hammering in my chest. There was no way anyone should have been out there in that kind of storm. No one in their right mind would venture so far into the wilderness with the wind howling like that. I called the sheriff, but the line was dead. The storm had taken out most of the communications, so I waited, watching from the window, my breath fogging up the glass. The figures moved closer, and I saw their faces, or what should have been faces. They were pale, drawn, almost skeletal, with eyes that glowed faintly in the dim light. Their skin was stretched tight as if they hadn't seen the sun in years. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up as they reached the edge of my property. My mind screamed at me to run, to lock every door and window, but something kept me rooted in place. There was something about the way they moved that drew me in, something I couldn't explain. Suddenly one of them turned its head, its gaze locking with mine through the window. I felt a chill run through my spine. It was like they could see into my very soul. I stumbled back, heart pounding, but they didn't move. They just stood there, staring. The wind howled louder, and in that moment, I realized something horrifying. These were the people who had disappeared, the ones who had vanished into the storm all those years ago. They hadn't died. They hadn't gotten lost. They had been changed. The storm outside grew fiercer, and before I could process what was happening, the figures turned and started walking away, slowly vanishing into the white abyss. I don't know how long I stood there, staring out the window, paralyzed with fear. Days passed, and the storm seemed to never end. I couldn't shake the feeling that they were still out there, watching, waiting. Each night I heard the whispers grow louder, though I couldn't tell where they were coming from. The isolation was maddening, and I felt as though I was losing my grip on reality. It wasn't until I ventured outside to investigate the next morning that I saw it. A small patch of snow, untouched, with strange symbols carved into the surface. They were old, ancient-looking, and I knew instinctively that they weren't from this world. I tried to leave the cabin to go to town for help, but something kept me from stepping out the door. Every time I tried, it felt like the snow was pushing back against me, as if the earth itself was trying to keep me inside. And that's when I realized I wasn't just stuck in the storm, I was part of it. Those people, lost to time and memory, had been changed by the cold, by the storm itself, and now they had come for me. The last thing I remember before the darkness took me was the sound of the wind howling louder than ever before, and then silence. The lake had always been a quiet place. In the summer, its glassy surface reflected endless skies, and in winter it became a frozen desert of pristine ice. My family's cabin overlooked its northern shore, isolated from the rest of the world. It was supposed to be a peaceful retreat, a place to escape the suffocating demands of city life. But that winter, the lake changed. It began with the noises. At first, I thought it was the ice shifting, a low resonant groaning that echoed across the valley. But the sounds didn't stop. They grew sharper, almost vocal, like whispers trapped beneath the ice. Late at night, I'd sit by the window, staring out at the frozen expanse, convinced I saw shapes moving beneath the surface. My wife dismissed it as cabin fever. "You're just not used to the quiet," she said, her smile brittle. But I could tell she was uneasy too. The air felt heavier, the shadows darker. One morning I found tracks leading from the woods to the lake. They were long and narrow, with too many joints to belong to any animal I knew. The prints stopped abruptly at the edge of the ice. I called out, my voice swallowed by the cold, but nothing answered. That night, I woke to the sound of tapping. It came from beneath the floorboards, a steady, deliberate rhythm. I grabbed a flashlight and crept down to the basement. The air was damp, the concrete walls sweating despite the freezing temperatures outside. The tapping stopped as soon as I reached the bottom step. I swept the flashlight beam across the room, my heart pounding. Something moved in the corner, a flicker of motion too quick to catch. I rushed forward, but there was nothing there. Just the old wooden hatch leading to the lake. My grandfather had built it decades ago, using it as a shortcut to the fishing shack. It hadn't been opened in years. The next day I noticed cracks in the ice. Thin, spiderweb fissures radiated from the center of the lake, forming strange, almost geometric patterns. The whispers grew louder that evening, a chorus of unintelligible murmurs that seemed to emanate from beneath the ice. "We need to leave," I told my wife, but she wouldn't hear it. "You're scaring yourself," she said. "It's just the wind." But I knew better. Something was under the ice, something ancient and restless. The tapping returned that night, more insistent. It wasn't coming from the basement this time. It was coming from inside the walls. I grabbed a hatchet and began tearing through the paneling, my wife screaming at me to stop. But when I broke through, there was nothing there. Just a hollow cavity, the sound receding as if mocking me. She packed a bag that night, saying she'd had enough. I begged her not to go, but she slammed the door and disappeared into the storm. I never saw her again. The whispers consumed me after that. They filled every waking moment, beckoning me to the lake. I found myself standing at its edge, staring down at the cracks, my reflection distorted and fractured. Shapes moved beneath the surface, their outlines fluid and shifting. One night the ice gave way. I plunged into the black, the cold searing my skin. The shapes surrounded me, their forms both alien and familiar. They whispered secrets I couldn't understand, their voices harmonizing into a single piercing scream. When I woke, I was on the shore, frostbitten and alone. The cabin was empty, my wife's belongings gone. The lake was still, its surface unbroken. But I could feel them watching from beneath, waiting for the ice to thaw. Winter swallowed the world whole, draping everything in a suffocating shroud of white. The remote research station I had called home for 3 months sat at the edge of a vast frozen expanse in northern Alaska. My colleagues had left the day before, heading south for the holidays. I had chosen to stay, partly out of pride, partly out of the irrational belief that the isolation would be good for my writing. The first night alone, the silence was deafening. The wind howled like a wounded animal, rattling the windows and seeping through the cracks. I bundled up, sitting by the generator's faint hum, and tried to write, but no words came. Outside, the snowstorm intensified, a wall of white obliterating the horizon. The station felt like an island adrift in a sea of nothingness. By the second day, I noticed the signal. It started faint, a series of intermittent beeps coming through the radio we used to communicate with supply teams. At first, I thought it was interference from the storm, but the beeps formed a pattern, a deliberate rhythm. Curious, I began to write them down. Long, short, long. A chill crept up my spine as I realized it was Morse code. Help me. I stared at the radio, the words burning into my brain. Who could it be? The nearest outpost was hundreds of miles away, and no one else was supposed to be out here. I tried responding, my voice trembling. This is Station Alpha 6. Who is this? Are you in danger? Silence. The storm raged on, and the beeping resumed an hour later, repeating the same desperate plea. I tried again, cycling through every frequency I knew, but the only answer was static. By nightfall, I convinced myself it was a prank or some atmospheric anomaly. But when I lay down to sleep, the unease lingered. Something about the signal felt wrong. On the third day, the snow stopped. A brittle, unnatural stillness settled over the world. I decided to investigate. Strapping on snowshoes and bundling myself in layers, I ventured into the frozen wasteland carrying a handheld radio. The signal grew stronger the further I went, the beeps transforming into a low, mechanical hum. After an hour of trekking, I saw it, a dark shape protruding from the snow, its edges sharp and angular against the pristine landscape. As I approached, my stomach twisted. It was a metallic structure, partially buried in the ice. It looked like no aircraft or vehicle I had ever seen, sleek and alien, with strange symbols etched into its surface. I hesitated, every instinct screaming at me to turn back, but the hum emanating from the object pulled me closer. I touched the metal, and a jolt shot through my body, leaving my fingers numb. The symbols glowed faintly, and the hum became a whisper. Come closer. The voice wasn't external, it echoed inside my head, a cold, emotionless monotone. My knees buckled, and I fell into the snow, gasping. When I opened my eyes, I wasn't alone. Figures emerged from the blizzard, their forms elongated and wrong. They glided over the snow without disturbing it, their faces hidden beneath featureless masks. They didn't speak, but I felt their intentions, sharp and invasive. They wanted me to follow them. I stumbled backward, my breath fogging the air. The figures advanced, their movements unnervingly synchronized. My radio crackled, the signal now a cacophony of overlapping voices, all whispering the same thing. You were never alone. I ran. The storm returned with a vengeance, the wind clawing at my face as I fled. I didn't stop until the station came into view, its familiar silhouette a lifeline. I barricaded myself inside, every shadow now a potential threat. The whispers followed me, faint but persistent, weaving through the howl of the wind. By the fifth day, I was no longer sure what was real. The figures appeared at the edges of my vision, watching from the snowdrifts. The signal grew louder, drowning out my thoughts. I tried calling for help, but the radio only emitted that maddening hum. The structure, whatever it was, wanted me back, and the things in the snow wouldn't stop until they had me. Winter camping is supposed to be peaceful, a chance to disconnect from the chaos of modern life. That's what I told myself when I pitched my tent in the middle of the forest, miles from the nearest town. The first night was everything I'd hoped for. Quiet, serene, with only the crackle of my campfire and the distant howl of wolves to keep me company. On the second night, I saw the footprints. They weren't mine. They weren't animal tracks either. They were human, bare feet pressed into the snow, leading away from my campsite into the darkness. I followed them for a few yards before they vanished, as if the person had simply disappeared. I told myself it was nothing, maybe a trick of the light, and returned to my tent. That night, I woke to the sound of something moving outside. It was faint, like someone dragging their feet through the snow. I unzipped the tent and shone my flashlight around. Nothing, just the trees and the falling snow. But when I turned off the light, I saw it. A shadow, tall and thin, standing at the edge of the clearing. It didn't move, didn't make a sound. It just watched. I stayed awake until dawn, clutching my knife and listening for any sign of movement. By morning, the shadow was gone, but the unease remained. I decided to cut my trip short and head back. As I packed up, I noticed something in the snow, more footprints circling my tent. They were fresh. The journey back to my car was a blur of fear and paranoia. Every snap of a branch, every gust of wind set my nerves on edge. I felt like I was being followed, though I never saw anyone. When I finally reached my car, I breathed a sigh of relief and turned the key. The engine roared to life, and I glanced in the rearview mirror. The shadow was there, standing at the edge of the parking lot, watching me. I slammed the gas and didn't look back. To this day, I don't know what it was. A trick of the light? A figment of my imagination? Or something far worse? All I know is that I'll never camp alone in the winter again. I thought I'd been prepared. The cabin in the woods was stocked with food, firewood, and books. The storm wasn't supposed to last this long. For days, snow fell like a smothering curtain, erasing the world outside my window. The wind howled, carrying strange sounds, not just the groaning of trees or the shriek of ice against glass, but whispers, words I couldn't make out but felt pressing against my mind. It started small. A knock at the door. I opened it to find nothing but swirling snow. Then I saw footprints leading away, bare human footprints, their edges crisp in the fresh powder. I followed them into the woods, and they disappeared under a towering pine. I looked up, and for a moment I swore I saw something clinging to the branches, watching me with eyes like frozen stars. Back at the cabin, I barricaded the door. The whispers grew louder, and I realized they were coming from inside the walls. By the third night, I couldn't sleep. I heard scratching like claws on wood, and then a voice called my name. It wasn't a scream or a shout, but a soft, familiar murmur, like someone I should know but couldn't place. I refused to answer, but the voice didn't stop. It whispered through the night, growing louder and closer until it was right outside the door. The next morning, I found more footprints. They circled the cabin, leading to the windows and back to the door. The storm showed no signs of stopping. I was trapped, alone except for the voices that seemed to know every secret I'd ever kept. I piled furniture against the door, stuffed blankets in the cracks, and lit every lamp I had, but it wasn't enough. The whispers seeped through, each one clearer than the last. They knew things about me, my fears, my regrets, even the dreams I'd never spoken aloud. Then came the knocking again, slow and deliberate. I grabbed the axe by the fireplace, my heart pounding. "Who's there?" I shouted, my voice cracking with desperation. The whispers fell silent. For a moment, the only sound was the wind howling outside. Then the voice answered, low and chilling, "Let us in." The next time I looked out the window, the world was gone. The snow had piled so high it covered everything, leaving me entombed in a white void. The air inside the cabin grew colder, frost creeping over the walls and ceiling. The fire refused to stay lit. I could feel them closing in, their whispers now a constant murmur, like a chorus of the damned. When I closed my eyes, I saw their faces, pale and hollow, their mouths moving in unison. I don't know how long I've been here now, days, weeks. Time has lost all meaning. The storm hasn't stopped, and the whispers are louder than ever. They're inside the walls, inside my head. I'm not sure if I'm alive anymore or if I've already joined them. We dared each other to skate on the lake, though everyone in the village knew the stories. They said the ice never truly froze because of the spirits trapped beneath it. But we were teenagers, too smart for old legends. The ice groaned as we skated, cracks spidering out like veins. When I looked down, I saw faces beneath the surface, pale, bloated, eyes wide and staring. One of them smiled. Before I could scream, the ice gave way. I plunged into the freezing water and the hands dragged me down. I fought, kicking and clawing, and somehow broke free. When I emerged, gasping, the lake was still, my friends gone. The villagers found me the next morning, but no one believed what I'd seen. The lake was silent after that, as if holding its secrets beneath the ice, but I wasn't free. Every night I dreamed of the faces. They whispered to me, their voices muffled as though they were still underwater. They wanted me to return. I could feel the cold creeping back into my bones, a chill that no fire could banish. Days turned to weeks, but the dreams never stopped. I began avoiding water entirely. No baths, no lakes, not even puddles. It didn't matter. I started seeing their faces everywhere. In the frost on my window, in the shadows under my bed, in the mirror when the room was too quiet. Their smiles were always the same, wide and empty, stretching too far. I tried to warn others, but no one believed me. They said the lake was just a lake, the ice just ice. But then the disappearances started, first a dog, then a child. The village began to whisper, fear creeping back into their voices. They'd forgotten the old stories, but the lake hadn't. It wanted them to remember. One night I woke to the sound of water dripping. I froze, my heart racing, but the sound didn't stop. Drip, drip, drip. When I turned on the light, I saw it. A puddle in the center of my room, clear and still. My breath caught as a face appeared in the water, grinning up at me. I ran, but the puddles followed. They were in the hallway, on the stairs, at the front door. Now I'm back at the lake, standing on its edge. The ice looks solid, but I know better. They're waiting beneath the surface, their hands reaching, their smiles beckoning. I can't fight it anymore. The cold has claimed me, just as it will claim you. The snow turned black overnight. At first we thought it was ash from a distant fire, but there was no smell, no warmth. The snow was cold as death, and when it melted, it left oily stains that wouldn't wash away. Animals started disappearing. The forest grew silent, as if holding its breath. Then, the snow came alive. I saw it moving in the moonlight, shifting and coiling like a nest of serpents. It slithered through the cracks of the barn and took the cows. I heard their lowing turn to shrieks. The next morning there was nothing left but bones. We tried to leave, but the snow blocked the roads, trapping us in its icy grip. My family is gone now, taken one by one. My sister was first. She thought she could run through it, that it was just snow, but I saw it devour her. My parents followed, trying to save her. Now I'm the last, and I can hear it scratching at the door. It's whispering to me, promising that it won't hurt if I just let it in. But I've seen what it does. I know better. At least, I hope I do. Every night it whispers my name, soft and sweet, like a lullaby. It promises warmth, safety, and an end to the cold. I've stopped eating, stopped sleeping. The black snow is all I can see, all I can think about. I know it's waiting for me to give in. Last night I saw my sister outside the window. Her face was pale, her eyes empty, but she smiled at me, her lips cracked and frozen. "It's not so bad," she said, her voice muffled by the snow. "You'll be warm again." I almost opened the door. Almost. I can still hear the ice groaning beneath my boots, a sound that haunts my dreams. It started when I rented a remote cabin deep in the Canadian wilderness for a week of solitude. I needed the escape, or so I thought. The journey itself was treacherous, the road narrowing to little more than a white tunnel carved through towering pines. By the time I arrived, twilight had already settled, and the cold was sharper than anything I'd ever felt. The cabin was quaint but sturdy, perched near the edge of a frozen lake. The first few nights passed uneventfully, with the snow falling in lazy drifts and the wind whistling through the eaves. Then, on the third night, I saw the figure. I'd been sitting by the fire, the flickering light casting uneasy shadows on the walls, when a movement outside caught my eye. There at the edge of the lake stood a man. He was tall and motionless, dressed in a heavy coat and fur hat. Something about him seemed off, though I couldn't place what. Perhaps it was the way he stood, unnaturally still, or the way the moonlight seemed to pass through him. I stepped out onto the porch, the bitter cold slicing through my clothes. "Hello?" I called. My voice echoed over the lake. The man didn't respond, didn't even flinch. Then just as I took a step closer, he was gone. No sound, no trace, just an empty expanse of snow and ice. The following days were a blur of paranoia. Every time I looked out the window, I expected to see him. I found footprints near the cabin, deep impressions in the snow, but they always stopped abruptly as if their maker had vanished into thin air. The nights grew longer, the darkness pressing against the windows like a living thing. The firewood supply dwindled faster than it should have, and I began to hear whispers in the wind, faint and indistinct. On the final night, I awoke to the sound of shattering glass. The front window was broken, icy wind howling into the cabin. Standing in the middle of the room was the man. His face was pale and skeletal, his eyes like black pits. He opened his mouth and a terrible sound filled the air, not a scream but the groaning of the ice beneath the lake. I ran, out into the snow, my breath burning in my lungs. I didn't stop until I reached the edge of the forest. When I turned back, the cabin was gone, replaced by an unbroken sheet of ice stretching as far as the eye could see. To this day, I don't know if it was real or if the isolation had driven me mad, but sometimes in the dead of winter I still hear the ice groaning. The blizzard came out of nowhere, a wall of white that swallowed the world. I was driving back from a work trip, the highway deserted and the snow thickening with every mile. My car's heater struggled against the biting cold and the visibility was so poor I could barely see the hood. When my car finally gave out, I was miles from the nearest town. The engine sputtered and died, leaving me stranded in the middle of nowhere. I bundled up in my coat and gloves, cursing my luck, and decided to walk. Surely there was a gas station or a rest stop nearby. The wind screamed around me, carrying with it a sinister, high-pitched wail. At first I thought it was just the sound of the storm, but it grew louder, more distinct. It sounded like a woman's voice, distant but desperate. I stopped and listened, the snow stinging my face. "Help me!" the voice cried, faint and broken. I hesitated. Logic told me no one could survive out here, not in this. But the voice was so human, so pained, that I couldn't ignore it. I followed the sound, trudging through knee-deep snow. It led me off the road and into the forest, where the trees were black silhouettes against the endless white. The voice grew fainter, but I pressed on, desperate to find its source. My fingers and toes were numb, my breaths coming in ragged gasps. Then I saw it, a figure slumped against a tree, half buried in snow. I rushed to it only to stop short. It wasn't a person. It was a mannequin, its plastic face cracked and its limbs bent at unnatural angles. Around its neck was a recorder, the source of the voice. As I stared in shock, the wailing stopped. Then the forest fell silent, utterly silent. Even the wind had died. That's when I heard the footsteps, slow, deliberate, crunching in the snow behind me. I turned, but there was no one there. Panic took over and I ran, the cold biting deeper with every step. I don't remember how I found the road again, but I did. My car was there, engine running, headlights cutting through the snow. I climbed inside, shivering uncontrollably. As I drove away, I glanced in the rearview mirror. The mannequin stood in the middle of the road, its head tilted, watching me. It was supposed to be a routine hike, just a quick trek up to the summit and back before the snowstorm hit. My friend Liam and I had done this trail dozens of times, but that day the mountain felt different. The air was heavy, the kind of cold that seeps into your bones no matter how many layers you wear. About halfway up, we found the cabin. It wasn't on any maps, and we'd never seen it before. The structure was old, its wooden beams sagging under the weight of snow, but the sight of smoke curling from the chimney was a welcome surprise. We knocked, but no one answered. The door creaked open under Liam's hand, revealing a cozy interior with a roaring fire. It felt too good to be true, but the storm was closing in, and we didn't have much choice. We settled in, grateful for the warmth. That night I woke to the sound of movement. At first I thought it was Liam, but his sleeping bag was empty. I called his name, but there was no answer. Grabbing my flashlight, I ventured outside. The snow was falling heavily, the beam barely penetrating the darkness. That's when I saw the footprints. They led away from the cabin straight into the forest. I followed them, calling for Liam, my voice swallowed by the storm. The tracks ended at a hole in the snow, a jagged opening that seemed unnaturally dark. I peered inside and my flashlight revealed a tunnel leading deep into the earth. A sound came from within, a low, guttural growl that made my skin crawl. I turned to run, but something grabbed my leg, pulling me down. I screamed, clawing at the snow, but the grip was relentless. Just as I was about to be dragged into the darkness, Liam appeared, hacking at the thing with a broken branch. It released me, and we ran without looking back. We made it back to the cabin, but the fire had gone out and the warmth was gone. The walls were coated in frost, and the air was filled with whispers. We didn't stay. By the time we reached the base of the mountain, the storm had passed and the cabin was nowhere to be found. We've never spoken about what happened, but every winter, when the snow is deep and the nights are long, I dream of that hole. And I know it's still there, waiting. The snowstorm came faster than we expected, but none of us were worried. We'd come prepared for a winter camping trip in the middle of nowhere. 5 friends, 1 cabin, and enough provisions to last a week. The first 2 days were a dream, snowshoeing through silent forests, sitting around the wood stove telling stories, and the occasional snowball fight. It was perfect, until the storm came. We first noticed it late in the afternoon, the sky turning an ominous shade of gray. Thick, heavy flakes began to fall, and by dusk, the wind was howling. It wrapped itself around the cabin like an unseen predator, shaking the shutters and creeping through the cracks in the walls. By midnight, it had become a full-blown whiteout. We couldn't see more than a few feet beyond the windows. We were stuck. No one minded at first. We had food, firewood, and good company. But then the noises started. At first, it was just the wind, or so we thought. A high-pitched wail would occasionally rise above the howling gusts, but it could have been anything. We laughed it off. By the second day, the laughter was gone. The wailing grew louder, more insistent, almost like a voice. Sam insisted it was just the wind funneling through the valley, but we all noticed the way his eyes darted to the windows when he said it. On the third night, Liz swore she heard footsteps crunching in the snow outside the cabin. We told her it was just a branch falling or the snow shifting. She didn't believe us, and honestly, I didn't believe myself either. By the 4th day, the storm still hadn't let up, and we were starting to feel the strain. Tensions rose as we debated whether to wait it out or try to hike back to the main road. That night, I woke to the sound of the front door creaking open. I bolted upright, heart pounding. The others were still asleep. I grabbed a flashlight and shone it toward the door. It was ajar, snow blowing in, but there were no footprints. I locked the door and returned to bed, but sleep wouldn't come. I lay there for hours, listening to the wind and the faint, mournful wailing. It was closer now, almost human. Around dawn, I heard a whisper right by my ear. "Get out." I shot out of bed, but the room was empty. I didn't tell the others. By the 5th day, we were unraveling. Liz refused to leave her sleeping bag, muttering about something in the storm. Sam and Emily were arguing constantly, and Chris wouldn't stop pacing. That night, we heard the footsteps again. This time, they circled the cabin, slow and deliberate. Then came the scratching at the windows. We barricaded ourselves inside, piling furniture against the doors and windows. The noises continued all night. Footsteps, scratching, whispers. None of us slept. When morning finally came, the storm had cleared. The world outside was blindingly white, eerily still. We decided to leave immediately, but as we stepped outside, we saw them. Footprints, dozens of them, circling the cabin and leading off into the woods. They were too large to be human, and they disappeared into the untouched snow. We never found out what made them, and we didn't look back as we hiked away. But even now, I can still hear that voice in my head. Get out. It was well into the evening when the first strange thing happened. The wind outside was howling, a constant sharp wail that carried the bitter cold through the thick walls of the cabin. I had moved to this remote area a few months ago, seeking solitude after the chaos of my life back in the city. The isolation had its comforts, but the winters here were unforgiving, especially this one. The snow had started early, blanketing everything in its path. I had barely seen anyone from the neighboring cabins since the storm began. Everyone here seemed to retreat into their homes at the first sign of the deep winter chill. I had just finished my dinner, a lonely meal of soup and bread, and was reading a book by the flickering light of a candle when I noticed it, a shadow moving across the window. At first, I thought it was just the wind playing tricks on my eyes, or perhaps the swaying of a tree outside. But then it came again, a dark shape crossing slowly in front of the glass. I jumped to my feet, heart pounding. The snow had been relentless for days, and the thought of someone out there in the blinding storm seemed impossible. I opened the door just a crack, the freezing air biting at my face, but there was nothing. Only the thick wall of snow and darkness, but that shadow, it wasn't just my mind, it was real. I closed the door and bolted it, trying to shake the cold creeping into my bones. I needed to ignore it. It was just the wind, I told myself. It had to be. But then a knock. It was soft at first, then louder, more insistent. I froze, staring at the door. No one else lived around here. The nearest neighbor, Greg, was miles away. And besides, no one would come out in this kind of storm. I hadn't seen him in weeks, not since I moved in. The knock came again, more desperate this time, followed by a voice. "Please, help me." I couldn't tell if it was a man or a woman, but the voice was weak, fragile, as if it belonged to someone barely hanging on. I stood there, paralyzed by indecision. On the one hand, I knew I couldn't let anyone freeze to death out there. But on the other, something didn't feel right. I knew the dangers of winter in these parts. If you didn't know exactly where you were going, you'd get lost within minutes, but the voice, it sounded so desperate. I opened the door just a crack again. This time the wind pushed it open wider, as if it were inviting me into the storm. And there, in the deep, swirling snow, was a figure standing motionless, staring at me. It was Greg. I didn't recognize him at first. His face was ghostly pale, eyes wide and glassy, and his body was covered in snow. But it was him, I was sure of it. "Greg, what happened to you?" I asked, my voice trembling. He didn't answer. Instead, he took a slow, unnatural step forward, his body stiff and jerky like a puppet on strings. His eyes never left mine. The door swung open wider as if pushed by invisible hands, and the air around me grew colder still. I could see nothing beyond him but the swirling white of the storm, as if the world had disappeared entirely. It was then that I realized Greg was no longer just a man. There was something wrong with him, something deeply, terrifyingly wrong. Without thinking, I slammed the door shut, but not before I saw his fingers, frozen stiff, press against the glass, his face pressed to it in a grotesque, pleading expression. The knocking stopped, but the chill lingered in the air. I haven't seen him since that night. The storm cleared, and the next day, when I gathered the courage to check, Greg's cabin was empty. No footprints in the snow, no sign of struggle, just the eerie silence that only deep winter can bring. Now, every time the wind howls or the snow piles high outside, I feel that cold presence, the shadow of someone or something watching from just beyond the window. I've never been a fan of winter. The long nights, the endless white blanket that cuts off all connection with the world beyond my doorstep, it's all too much. So when I moved to the old farmhouse, I was hesitant to face the upcoming winter. The place was secluded, but it was cheap, and I needed to get away from the stress of the city. What I didn't expect was for the isolation to turn so unnerving. My neighbor, Marcus, was a strange man. He lived in a house just beyond the forest that separated our properties. We barely saw each other, but I always felt as though he was watching. You know how you get that feeling sometimes, like someone's eyes are boring into your back? That was Marcus. He was tall, thin, with sharp features, and always dressed in dark, heavy clothes that seemed too warm for the weather. There was something unsettling about the way he moved, as though he was always half a step behind me. The first sign something wasn't right came one evening when I went outside to retrieve some firewood. The sun had barely set and the air was already bitterly cold. As I passed the edge of the woods, I thought I saw a figure moving in the trees. Slow, deliberate steps, almost as if someone were following the exact same path I was taking. I froze. The figure stopped too. I couldn't make out his face in the dim light, but I knew it was Marcus. He was standing there, just watching me. I called out, but he didn't respond. I waved my hand, trying to break the strange tension between us, but he simply turned and disappeared into the trees. That night, the wind kicked up and the cold seeped through every crack in my cabin. It was the kind of cold that gnawed at your bones, unrelenting. I tried to sleep, but the sound of something moving outside kept me awake. Footsteps in the snow, but always just out of reach of my vision. The next day, I decided to confront Marcus. I bundled up against the biting cold and made my way to his house, determined to ask him what he was doing lurking in the woods, but when I arrived, his house was eerily silent. No smoke from the chimney, no sign of life. I knocked, but there was no answer. I shouldn't have gone inside, but I did. The door creaked open with little resistance, revealing an even colder interior. The house was dark, the windows covered by heavy tattered curtains. As I stepped inside, the silence was suffocating, broken only by the sound of my breathing and the creak of the floorboards beneath me. I called out, but no one answered. That's when I noticed it. The walls. They were covered in strange markings, scratches, gouges, as if something had been trying to claw its way out. There were symbols, too, drawn hastily in what looked like dark ink. I turned to leave, but that's when I saw him. Marcus was standing in the doorway, his face pale and drawn, eyes wide, too wide. He smiled, but it wasn't a friendly smile. It was something else. "Did you come to join me?" he whispered, his voice rough, barely a breath above a rasp. "The cold always takes those who wander too far." Before I could respond, he lunged at me, his hands icy cold, his fingers like frozen claws. I fought him off, stumbling back towards the door, but as I crossed the threshold, I saw something that chilled me to my core. Beyond the trees where Marcus had stood the night before, a group of figures, dark, indistinct, were watching, their eyes glowing faintly in the dark. The storm rolled in that night, and as the snow piled higher and the wind howled like a living thing, I realized that the people I'd seen were never human at all. I haven't seen Marcus since, but I hear him sometimes, in the darkness outside my window. And the cold never goes away, not completely. It lingers in the corners, creeping just behind me, waiting for me to turn around. And every night the wind carries a whisper. Join us. If you've made it to the end, don't forget to like and subscribe. Also, drop a comment to let me know where you're listening from.